I am Ted Cooley, and this is the ninth lecture in response to Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, covering chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17. This particular chapter is hard to put together, as Eleanor and I have had contacts with fringes of the civil rights movement over several years in the 60s and early 70s. My mother caught the Spanish flu in 1919, resulting in the weakening of her bone structure and placing her in a children's hospital for most of her adolescent years. This was in Kansas City, so the help in the hospital included numerous African Americans. Her respect for these women left her more radicalized than either the rest of her family or my father's family. One of her friends, as a school teacher in the South in the late 1930s, though white, insisted in riding in the back of the bus as a silent protest to the segregation system. My mother was very proud of this friend and her actions. This influence eventually assisted my unlearning a lot of the childhood assumptions of Middle America, which were part of my cultural baggage. Eleanor's maternal grandfather had moved from Clinton, Wisconsin to Madison because of his openness to serving and selling to all people in his grocery store in Clinton, which had produced negative pressure on his business. Thus, both of us had influences pushing the progressive, though not radical, action at the time of our marriage. I had traveled with relatives through the South in 1959, the summer between high school and college, seeing for myself the separate and unequal situation. Being from New Mexico, I suspect I was more uncomfortable than the rest of the family coming from the Midwest and Upper South. Being considered still a child by the adults, I made few comments about the situation, despite its impression on me. Hence, we come to Zinn's chapter 17. Zinn's review of Black literature from the 20s is very interesting, as much of this was new, though both the spirituals and jazz were already part of my heritage before completing high school. An illustration of how contacts and learning take place. We have a friend from Germany who in 1945, she and her mother were on their bicycles fleeing west ahead of the Russian troops during the last months of World War II. When they reached the river, which would be the new divide between the East and West, the welcoming United States troops were an African American detachment, which served for these women as saviors for these. She still shares this interesting introduction to the American racial situation. For years, I have supported the Tuskegee Airmen Association through the Red Tail Squadron in their P-51Cs. They had possibly the best fighter record in support of the bombers of any group in Europe in World War II. General Davis, their commander, was an excellent example of the quality of their leadership. After the ruling of Brown versus Board of Education, President Eisenhower brilliantly exercised his authority in nationalizing the Arkansas National Guard, returning them to their barracks, and sending in the 101st Airborne to integrate Little Rock High. His usage of the power of the president without violating the institution of the presidency shows what a competent person he was. Our next door neighbor now, from a military family, was a child in Montgomery, Alabama, where her dad was stationed at the time. Reports that her mother was one of the base wives driving African American help from their homes in their part of town to the jobs on base during the boycott. Either Zinn did not know or just chooses to admit it, but Rosa Parks had had extensive training in nonviolent methods of civil protest before she sat down toward the front of that bus. In 1962, a new graduate student, Ben, joined me in the data reduction section of my student employment. He was one of the first 2 Black students to be admitted to the Graduate School of New Mexico State, having omitted his photo from the application form so as to not identify by race. Married, he lived a block from us in married housing. His wife was a student in the social sciences, having classes with Eleanor and myself. Soon we were socially connected, even sharing our automobile, as they had none, to attend the drive-in theater, the 4 of us together, and drawing stares from the employees as we entered the drive-in. Las Cruces was more southern of a mind than Albuquerque. As I was in seminary at TCU in 1964 with a student church in East Texas, we were asked to use our pickup to transport duplicate books from the TCU library to the school library at Jarvis Christian College, an African American mission school of the Disciples, and we made 2 such trips with loads of books. At the time, I did not realize how paternalistic the whole procedure was, though we enjoyed the fellowship with the staff at Jarvis. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at the Disciple National Convention in 1966 in Dallas, which we attended. By 1968, King was connecting the civil rights and general poverty of the underclass, regardless of race, which led him to Memphis. I now realize how much of this was on the surface, though the effort to support necessary change was certainly present. The dark side of change, violent and full of brutality by the police and subversion by the FBI and other government agencies, which Zinn presents, comes as a sharp contrast to the push for change in which we shared. In 1967, Eleanor and I went to Effingham County, Georgia, to serve our first church. Rather, a unity of a very rural congregation and one in a small town. Eleanor soon went to work as a welfare worker as we acquired a domestic for childcare and light cleaning. We were thoroughly warned about the standards of behavior expected with respect to the African American community. By 1968, Eleanor's revelations working welfare and mine in the community were at odds with what we had been told. That summer, I had 2 weeks teaching church camp while returning home to preach on Sunday. Eleanor's grandmother was terminally ill in Wisconsin. Eleanor offered free transportation, food, and lodging to any woman in the congregation who would go with her and the twins, aged 2.5, for a last visit with her grandmother. No takers. Finally, she asked the daughter of our African American domestic if she would consider it. So she and her daughter, a teenager, accepted. Great trip. However, following this trip, Eleanor referred to this lady who had accompanied her as a friend. She was informed that this was a terrible mistake. Blacks could not be friends. Seeing the handwriting on the wall as our ministry there, we made contact with an African American lawyer in Savannah, since the only minority persons in our county which could speak up in any manner without losing a job for those who worked outside of the county, we were able to provide a list of contact people in the African American community to this lawyer so that the NAACP could undertake an organizational drive. No mention of this was made. We resigned and returned to New Mexico with our tails between our legs, without income, to fall upon the support of Eleanor's parents. After we were safely gone, the NAACP organization was established, with the largest check going into their new account coming from us. Later, we learned that the one white who was willing to serve on the PTA for the junior high, which had been the former black segregated school, was a member of the congregation we had served. She was on a second marriage, having divorced her first husband for numerous affairs, and was also working on her college degree in a college out of the county, which was in and of itself in that community considered scandals. Toward the end of the chapter, Zinn gives a Hispanic illustration from 1977 with no connection with anything around it. I wonder if you could not find an appropriate African American illustration on housing discrimination. A final note on integration unions complete the chapter. This is our story, not in the center of violence, but even at the fringe, a time of concern and fear. Zinn seems to favor presenting the most violent interpretation, though the violence continues, as we know, even to today. I still believe that some change can come peaceably through communication and true friendship. This is a personal, but there are thousands like us moving moderately for change, as was found possible. I believe that the civil rights movement's progress is far more due to these thousands of moderates working on the problem when they could than the violent position that Zinn shares. Chapter 18. In the spring of 1961, I was in my fourth and last semester of required Army ROTC at New Mexico State. The required course for this last semester was small unit tactics. I was aware of significant discrepancies between the course of study and the news from Vietnam before the end of the semester. Something was wrong between the instructions of the course and the information coming from the press on the situation. Zinn goes to great lengths to explain the contradictions of the war and the personages involved. The level of government deception and lies set a new low for integrity in the administration in Washington. Ho Chi Minh was our ally in the war against Japan, yet we double-crossed him to support the French return after the war, when he had declared an independent government with quotes from our own historical documents as part of the celebration establishing the new government. For several years, I've had morning coffee with a group of men who include a soldier with 3 tours in Vietnam. He confirmed that the U.S. forces were instructed not to fire into the Michelin rubber plantations, though the Viet Cong used them as a refuge. At times, it appeared that the purpose of the war was more to promote this French tire manufacturer than anything else. This was primarily a war of national liberation, an important understanding, a war of national liberation, just our colonial war of revolution was. And colonial powers have had a very low success rate in overcoming such movements. The British in Malaysia in the 1940s had success as their opposition was an ethnic minority of Chinese, which could be separated from the majority Southeast Asian society. I do not know of another situation where a war of national liberation was successfully suppressed. The British in East Africa, the French in West Africa, India to the regret of Winston Churchill, the US and the Philippines, all went their own ways in the 2 decades after World War II. Our government simply refused to see the historical trend, which appears to be irreversible. Zinn documents the war protests, draft card burnings, refusal to enter into draft process, and resistance from those outside the military service. He also cites resistance of those in uniform. My brother-in-law was on a naval ammunition supply ship off the North Vietnam coast, loading bombs on an adjacent aircraft carrier on Christmas Day, as the sound system of the ship was playing Christian Christmas carols. He certainly was aware of the contradiction of the situation. There was a significant increase in creative pharmacology, both among those called into service and those bent on escape, to dull the pain of this era. I had a first cousin who went to Canada when drafted, though he may have actually never crossed the border, as his use of mind-altering drugs while absent from his family limited his social potential for the rest of his life. This was all too common and remains today as one of the social handicaps within our society as a result of the misadventures of this war. Zinn almost does an overkill of the social and moral disruptions brought about by the lies in high government places in an attempt to justify the war. It can become a depressing chapter, for the social disruption and pressures on the lower class for the grunts to carry out the administration's orders are still dividing social groups within our country. With the military still significantly staffed by Black and brown volunteers, the resentment towards those of the upper class, almost all white, and who mostly avoided the draft, is part of the social and political tensions of today. It is interesting that Vietnam is now a large source of our manufacturing for many items previously done in China, as well as siding with the United States against China's attempt to dominate the South China Sea with reefs turned into islands to establish claims of control of possible oil-bearing strata under the ocean. The history of CIA coups and changes in power of government lacking the support of the people, not really attempting to reach the needs of the peasants, is well documented by Zinn. The stress, interestingly enough, of women's rights in Laos is an additional information on the attraction of the social revolution, which made the changes so popular. Similarly, the expansion of medical treatment in Cuba was an additional attraction for the revolution, which we have not adequately recognized in our own system of medical service provision. The opposition to the war grew within the United States until higher and more prominent spokespersons began to take up the message. In 1967, Martin Luther King firmly came out against the war. The lack of support among these citizens most likely to serve in the draft is reported by Zinn to be stronger than generally assumed. The support within certain parts of the Catholic Church, despite the Catholic community in Vietnam being basically allied with U.S. war efforts, is an example of far-reaching changes within that church, which are still progressing. Sometimes to be silent is to lie, is too often not stressed in political discussions when power is on the wrong side. The massive lying of the power structure from both political parties, which characterized the Vietnam era of the United States politics, should serve as a guide on how not to govern, though the lesson seems to be very, very hard to learn. This chapter is simply filled with exposed lies by the government and political figures. We would hope that our society has learned from this experience, though the effort to adapt to a policy of open honesty seems hard for some leaders to learn. The quote, the time is past when good men can remain silent, when obedience can separate men from public risk, when the poor can die without defense, unquote, is powerful. It seems to be a lesson which is very, very hard to learn. The Vietnam War is not the first time we have lost, though we won the peace treaty in the War of 1812. The loss of so many lives and such wealth and the continuing suffering of many of the veterans from Vietnam should teach this nation some humility, though this does not seem to be the case. End of chapter 16. Thank you. Chapter 19.